Welcome everyone to Writing Inclusive Docs. I'm Chris Fritz from the Vue team. For those who aren't familiar with Vue and maybe even don't do web development, my inclusive definition of what Vue is we build the parts of websites that people can see, or help you build the parts of websites that people can see and make it really interactive. That's what I do at parties, or that's how I introduce myself, so I don't just get blank stares. I work more in the front end. Front end? What? And my official title, or semi-official title on the team, is Good Word Putter Togetherer, which means I work not only on documentation, but just communication in general. Communication within the team, communication outside the team, communication with partners, just trying to find the right words to help everyone get along and to help us get our work done. And I want to let you know, if you were hoping you would come to this and be thinking, wow, they must have the most inclusive docs in the world and history. This is the world's expert on inclusivity and documentation. And we have everything figured out. We've made no mistakes. We have nothing more to learn. That is definitely not true. So I would love, afterwards, if people have their own stories for documentation that they'd like to share and how they've managed to make their documentation more inclusive. I would love to hear it, because this is a learning process for me as well. Before we go any further, I want to define what inclusion means exactly, or what I mean specifically when I talk about inclusion. I mean meeting people where they are, despite differences in language, culture, gender, cognition, physical abilities, emotional state, communication, energy, distractedness, available time, and a lot more, which is a lot. It's hard to keep up with that. It's hard to keep track of making sure that you're actually serving everyone. So how do you do it? How do you keep the people that you're serving in mind as you're building documentation, designing documentation and other educational resources, as you're communicating with your communities, if you're an open source framework? And I really like to build personas. I'm not an expert on personas. Really, most of what I learned is from people that I've worked with who do know a lot more. But I like to ask questions like, who are you serving? How are they using your docs? What are they looking for, in that moment of documentation? Are they trying to solve a bug, for example? Figure out what might be going wrong? Are they trying to learn about a feature that they read about in a blog post? Do they have 4 hours? Do they have 10 minutes before their next meeting? These are all considerations that you'll learn more about once I disconnect this and reconnect it, hopefully. Beautiful. I'll just have to do that every 5 minutes, probably. So here's an example of a very small part of a persona. Let's call someone Alice. She goes by she, her, gender pronouns, 36 years old, African American, born, lives in Atlanta, Georgia, BA in computer science, 36 years young. And I describe her personal life, her professional life. This is a story, a very specific story I make up, including details of when she used jQuery or AngularJS or React. What did she like? What did she not like about those things? What problems did they solve for her? What problems did they create? What keeps her up at night? And of course, as Tracy Lee, who you may know if you were here the first day, said a couple days ago, you can't just hope that diversity happens. When you want to make sure that you're serving everyone, you need to make sure that as many kinds of people as possible are represented in your work, at your workplace, in your project. So inclusion starts at home. Natalia Tepluhina, a member of our Vue team who focuses on documentation, says that we need to make our team as diverse as possible. Having people of different genders, backgrounds, social groups, etc., allows us to have a wider perspective and match more expectations. And in some ways, on our team, we do a very good job of that. Throughout the entire team, we are spread out between, I think, 12 different countries and 9 different time zones. We are one of the most widely distributed open source software teams in the world, in that a meteor could wipe out a hemisphere and we'd be okay. Hopefully it doesn't. I mean, emotionally we wouldn't be okay, but the project would live on. And I think on the docs team specifically, out of the 4 of us who focus mainly on docs, none of us grew up within 1,000 miles of each other. We have 2 women, 2 men, mostly white, and the person who isn't white is Asian, is Vietnamese. So there's obviously more work that we could do if you're interested in writing documentation. We would love to talk to you and get you more involved in the community. That's something else that I do a lot, helping onboard people to the community and getting them more involved in open source, helping them solve their own problems, while giving back. What are the goals of inclusion? For me, the number one goal, or one of the number one goals, the goal number one of the 2 number one goals, is to serve everyone. As Sarah Drasner, another member of our docs team, says, Doxer didn't happen. There are a lot of people who have tons of resources. They can buy books and courses, and they have tons of free time, and maybe they don't have any kids, and they don't have a lot of responsibilities. Maybe they're the typical 22-year-old white man, who's maybe mother still does their laundry, and they just can focus on doing stuff, and they have lots of resources to learn whatever it is they want to learn, no matter what. And documentation, for a project, is one of the only sources that is provided to the community for free that everyone knows about. You don't need to be in some inner circle to know about these. You don't need to live somewhere where there's a lot of meetups. And as Damien says, another member of the Vue team, the biggest challenge when building open source is fighting the need to please everyone, which might sound strange because I just talked about serving everyone. So we're serving everyone, but we need to make sure we're not trying to please everyone. What's going on? I want to make this distinction very clear. You're not a pizza. You can't make everyone happy. So no matter what, everything is going to be a compromise. You can be funny, and approachable, or more direct and to the point. You can be concise, or you can be thorough, exploring all the possible edge cases. You can be understandable, or accurate, and go into not only how this feature works, but also how we built it, and if you find some bug, here's how you would contribute. So in deciding who to really focus on while you're serving everyone, when you have to make a compromise, I suggest focusing on those who actually need you. The people with a lot of resources, they're going to be fine, honestly. They're often the loudest voices because they have the most free time, so they can just leave a bunch of messages and issues, complaining about the things that they care about, and I recommend listening to those things. But the people who are struggling more, the people who need you more, are often a little bit quieter, and you have to do more work to find them. They're maybe not living in the big tech hubs. They're maybe too busy to go to 4 meetups a week. They maybe have a life outside of work. They maybe want a better balance. Maybe they're more focused on solving specific problems than just chasing the latest fad. So I recommend serving everyone, but prioritizing the underserved. And I think you might be surprised at how often that helps you serve everyone. Inclusion goal number 2, let's build something beautiful. Like, we want to build beautiful docs that we're proud of, and we can, show our moms or our dads and say, hey, I did that. And they can see, like, that looks good. I don't know I don't know exactly what you do still, but it looks great. And we want to help other people build beautiful things as well, particularly for Vue. But bureaucracy only scales through diversity. You need often a team to really build something beautiful. And a lot of people have probably encountered this. When you go from 1 person to 2 people, 1 developer to 2 developers, does productivity always increase? No, it doesn't, especially at the beginning. Sometimes it goes down. And then people get frustrated, especially if this is a startup, and it's like, I hired another person because we needed to go faster. Why are we going slower? Because suddenly you have to communicate. You have to negotiate. And if everybody thinks in the same way, sometimes there's less communication. It can be tempting to go for another, if you just hired a 22-year-old white man, just out of I don't know, some university that I can't think of right now. I can't think of any universities. Georgia Tech. There we go. Then you could hire another person exactly like that, and they get along so well, and they play ping pong in between code sessions, and but in the long run, you might really be hurting yourself. Alan Kay once said, "A change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points." And I really believe that's true. The people that we bring on to the Vue team, one of the things I look for is this someone who thinks we're doing things wrong? And do they know how to communicate? And do they know how to communicate well and respectfully, to help us do it better? I don't want people who disagree with me, who think all the time with me. Sometimes we have a lot of discussions, a lot of arguments, because our brains don't work the same way. Our backgrounds are different. The things we do for our work are different, outside of the open source project. Our cultures are different. But we're able to come to understandings that never would have been possible with any one of us individually. We're able to build something better. Now, for the rest of the talk, I want to go into some steps to inclusive docs, including designing, writing, and maintaining. So generally, before you're writing your documentation, some things to keep in mind. As you're writing, some things to keep in mind. And then maintaining. What can you do to maintain and make sure your docs continue growing in inclusivity? Because you'll never have completely inclusive docs. But it's important to keep having these conversations and to keep trying to measure how well you are serving everyone in the community. So first, designing. How many people have been trying to work on something and then suddenly they get a bunch of Slack notifications? Does it make it hard to concentrate when things are pulling at you all the time? So in documentation, something that can pull at your attention, especially if you have some kind of attention deficit disorder, like I do, is no looping GIFs or animations. When I'm reading a blog post and there's an animated GIF that I can't stop, I have to inspect the page, find that element, delete it before I can read on. Or else I literally can't see anything else. You also don't want your website to be too busy visually. For those who can't see the title here, this is what I mean. Not too busy visually. This is possibly an extreme example. But when you have a lot of different colors and a lot of like different layouts and different sizes of things, like all of that is like different kinds of information that is screaming at you, telling you like, that this is like, I'm important, look at me too. A lot of times, I actually have trouble in an American grocery store sometimes. It's hard for me to shop in American grocery stores without medication, without having a panic attack, because I feel like things are screaming at me constantly. So not too busy visually. I recommend building your docs like your favorite place to study. Something like this. But how does it translate to a web page? How does a space translate to a web page? Well, documentation is a space. It's a space where you're hanging out. You're spending some time there. And just like when you're picking a good cafe to study or work, you look for certain attributes, things that are going to make it easy to get your work done. You want something quiet, probably, not like overwhelmingly noisy, or maybe get some like good noise-canceling headphones. Not too noisy visually, probably as well. If there's people like bumping into you and going around and stopping by you and trying to talk to you. You want something friendly? You want to feel welcome here? And something inspiring. You want to feel more powerful as you're building. So, I'm not talking about any specific design principles. There are other people at this conference who are giving talks more on design, and they'll be able to tell you way more than I ever could. Honestly, I'm not a very good designer. I get other people to try to help me with that. I tell them like the kind of the words that I'm looking for, like, and how I want people to feel. Available offline is also important. A lot of times when I'm on a plane, I like to bring a book because it's something I don't need the internet for, and I don't want to pay $20 for possibly available internet while I'm on the plane. But if your docs are available online, then they can read them and possibly do some work while they're traveling or when their internet goes out. In a lot of parts of the world, that's pretty common for the internet to go out. So I recommend looking into progressive web apps for offline availability. Again, that's a huge topic that other people at this conference actually are going over or have already gone over. So I hope you saw that one, or else you can check out the talk online later. And also accessible. This is another big topic, and I've hinted at some pieces of accessibility here. But it's just so huge. And other people are handling that better, so I'm going to focus on some of the other aspects. So that's designing. Now for writing inclusive docs. My first tip is to declare assumed knowledge. A lot of times when I'm going in to learn something, they might say, okay, so we're going to teach you how to build a spa. And the first time I saw that term, I'm thinking like a website for a spa, like where you go to get like massages and facials. And they never explained it. And I looked up spa, I Googled spa, and you can imagine what I found. It wasn't too helpful. But after the stressful experience, I did book a massage. And I felt stupid, and I messaged a friend and asked, what am I missing? Can you help me figure this out? And it's like, oh, it's single-page application. And it's like, so like a website with only one page? And it's like, no, it usually has a lot of pages. But why is, okay. So any knowledge that you're assuming, like if you expect people to know a certain level of HTML, a certain level of JavaScript, if you expect them to know certain words, link to definitions. Let them know what they should know. Or else they're going to feel overwhelmed right away and feel like, okay, I guess this is just too complicated. Or I'm not smart enough. I also recommend when you're coming up with titles in your documentation, do not start with the solution or feature. Start with the problem. When people are being introduced to something for the first time, if they see a title like JavaScript arrays, they are very new to JavaScript and they don't know what arrays are, very new to programming, they have no idea what this is, whether this is relevant to them. They've never heard the word array before. So they have no context for what's to come. So instead, I recommend titles maybe like make lists of anything in JavaScript with arrays. And that gives you the context to know whether you care. It's like, oh yeah, I need to make lists sometimes. Like, I have a bunch of products and I want to list out the products and their prices. Or I have a bunch of pages and I want to list out the pages. Now, what to write first? This is one of the most common questions I get for people who are trying to write documentation. And my number one tip is to try to find ways to maximize power per effort. Think of what will make people the most powerful, feel the most powerful, with as little effort as possible. What one thing can you teach that will open up as many possibilities as possible and make them feel energized? You ever feel that way when you're learning something where you just like unlocked a new skill and it's like, oh, I can do all of these things now. I could use this for this and that. And back when I had this problem, I could have just used this. And when they have that feeling of power and you can maintain it, they'll keep reading all day. But if they don't know why they're learning what they're learning, or if you first start with well, here's a bunch of foundational things and you won't be able to do anything with it yet, but wait until chapter 10 and things are going to get, you're going to be able to do a lot. They're probably not going to make it through chapter 1. I promise you. And only one new concept at a time. It's so tempting, especially because we get excited about these things, to just talk about all the things that we're excited about at once. But you really do need to count them, both in text and in code. If you've never had an array in the documentation before, at least let people know that you're going to see something that looks like this. Don't worry about it for now, although avoid even that if you can. Because everything that they have to keep track of and learn it, try to learn in parallel, is going to vastly increase the cognitive power that they're draining. Because at a certain point, how many people usually read every line of the documentation when they're learning something new for the first time? My hand is up as an example, but I don't. Yeah. Eventually, you just run out of energy, run out of time. But by keeping to one concept at a time and keeping people feeling powerful, you can maximize the amount of time that they'll keep reading, the amount of things that they'll learn. I also recommend being emotionally relevant. Tell a story that people are going to care about, that they'll be able to relate to. Here's an example of a story in our docs where we have a button counter component which makes a button that when you click on it, keeps track of how many times you clicked. And we also talk about how you can reuse these components. And we show how you can reuse them, and each of them keeps track of how many times they've been clicked. And then we talk about why this data property has to be a function that returns an object rather than just an object, by showing what happens if it wasn't a function. All these buttons share the same count. So whenever you click on one, the count for the others goes up too. And I realized while making this, you know what, this tells a story, but it's not as emotionally relevant as it could be. Why aren't these like buttons? Like, that's something that people use every day. That's something that people might build. They can see themselves building and having uses for that. So if I made these like buttons, suddenly this becomes a lot more emotionally relevant, and they can see exactly what they'd use this for. Okay, so I can keep track of like how many likes each video has, and I don't want all the videos to have the same number of likes. Like whenever one video gets a like, all the videos get a like. That would be dangerous. It suddenly makes a lot more sense to them. So I'm actually going to be changing that later. So these slides will be, this slide will be broken, hopefully. It won't include the good example, or it'll include an even better example. And also to inspire people, here's one of our lazy Sudoku examples to show off one of our animations that we try to make easier. And one of the first questions people often ask is, so can you actually win? And I tell them, look at the code. And then they're in the code and they're hooked. They're fooling around with it. They're learning more than I even planned. For the writing style, this is maybe an obvious one, but I recommend just avoiding he, she pronouns in general. I have never needed them. Instead, use you, the royal we, they. Avoid colloquial expressions. How many people, raise your hand if you are familiar with the phrase, same difference? Okay, raise your hand, keep your hand raised, keep your hand raised. Okay, now only keep your hand raised if you did not grow up in the United States. A lot of hands going down, funny. I did not grow up in the United States, and the first time I heard same difference, even after people explained it to me, I had no idea what they were talking about. You can imagine the first time I heard beat a dead horse. I was pretty alarmed. I assumed they weren't talking about actually beating a horse, but I was still confused and distracted. Like it took me out of what they were trying to tell me. It was a distraction from what I needed to know, and then I had to go back and like try to figure out if I could understand from context what they were saying. And then, I mean, thankfully we have like Urban Dictionary, but a lot of this stuff isn't on Urban Dictionary because Americans who are mostly moderating Urban Dictionary assume, well, everybody knows that. Even examples like, let's dive into this example. As long as people have the vocabulary to understand the word dive, they can probably figure out what you mean. But it might take them an extra second. And that extra second adds a higher cognitive load, and it takes them out of the flow of their reading a little bit. You know, so when other words are just as good, like let's look into this example, try that instead. As long as you're going for an international audience. I also recommend fostering a predilection for elemental prose. Or prefer simple language. That's another way to put it. Yeah, because when you use a lot of complex words, you know, that mean the same thing, you're distancing people. And even for me, like, I speak English pretty fluently. I know what that means. I wrote it. I know those words. But if I had to read those words somewhere, even I'd be like, foster predilection. Oh, okay, I see what they mean. You know, it even takes me longer. So this is another case where, you know, by making the documentation more accessible for like some group of people who do not speak English as well, who do not have as large a vocabulary, you're making it easier for everyone. And there's a really cool resource here, xkcd.com/simplewriter, that will actually, if you type some stuff in here, it'll flag any words that are not in the 1,000 most commonly used words in English. And I don't recommend writing docs only with the 1,000 most commonly words in English, but this is a great exercise to see when a word is flagged, is there another more common word that could actually do the same thing? Like for prefer, we could just say use, use is a more common word. But prefer, which may be surprising, isn't. And be precise. When I said prefer simple language, what does simple mean? That wasn't a great way of putting it. Simple could mean like not a lot of syllables. It could have meant like use really common words. It could have mean, don't use too many words. What I meant was use well-known words. And here I'm not only using the 1,000 most commonly used words in English, but I'm being more specific. Generally, when you find yourself using words like, simple or easy, you're not only more likely to be being a little vague, but you'll probably also alienate a lot of people, because if they don't find something easy or simple, suddenly they think like, oh, I guess I'm just an idiot, because it's not easy to me. I felt like that sometimes. And everybody in here is probably really funny. Humor has a place. Humor can be great sometimes, but I would avoid it in documentation most of the time. Sometimes we slip in some humor, like, grocery list, vegetables, cheese, whatever else humans are supposed to eat. And I'm still on the fence on that. Sometimes I stare at it late at night and just think, I don't know if I should remove it. We haven't gotten any complaints yet, but that doesn't mean anything. It does use mostly words that people are familiar with. I don't know. But I'm going to give one more example that may surprise you. Like, I had a page in the docs that had like a really cute cat picture. And you might be thinking, who wouldn't like a cat picture? Like, cat pictures are great. It would just like make you feel really good. Like if you're learning something, you're a little bit stressed, a cat picture, it's like, oh yeah, all right, I'm not so stressed anymore. Like only a monster would hate a cat picture. But I heard from people in our community that, they didn't have a problem with the cat picture. They didn't hate cats or anything, or a cat didn't scar them. But they found that like they got anxious when the cat picture was on their screen at work, because they're worried their boss would come by and think that they weren't working, that they were just looking at cats. And so it had the opposite effect that I was intending. That's a real example, so I took it out. And always avoid sarcasm. How many people just talking to a native speaker of any language have found that sarcasm sometimes doesn't come across exactly as you intended in text? Raise your hand. Yeah? Yeah? So imagine when people do not speak the language natively, are not familiar with the specific style of sarcasm in your culture. It's going to get worse than with your friends. There's a really good, I wanted to include it, but I cut it. There's a really good Key and Peele sketch where they're texting each other. And it's like, where do you want to go tonight? It's like, wherever you want to go. It's like, wherever you want to go. Yeah, cool. And the other person, wherever you want to go. It's great, yeah. Watch it later. Just look up Key and Peele and watch all the sketches until you find that one, because they're all good. Prefer uncomplicated sentences. So usually only 2 or 3 clauses maximum. If you go on for a long time and people have to keep, and it's like, and I recommend until you do this, for the time being, you can make sure to install this before, and just like, people is like, where do we start? And they have to read the sentence like 3 or 5 times, and then maybe just skip it and decide like, well, maybe it'll be clearer later. Remove unnecessary words, like most adverbs. In documentation, when you would say actually, easily, or quickly, it's basically words that end in ly. They're actually not necessary in many cases. They don't add any meaning. They just add bloat. Avoid ambiguity. For example, can someone give me a good definition of a server? Yeah, everyone's afraid, right? Like, this is a word a lot of us probably use all the time in our day jobs, but we're now thinking like, okay, well, like a server could be like a physical machine, or it could be the software, and actually it could be like the backend framework that we're using, like Ruby on Rails or Django, or like the Express if we're using Node or something like that. Or I guess it could also be like Nginx or Apache. It could be that level of software. So it can mean so many different things. If you can find a better word or multiple words to describe more specifically what you mean, it's always going to be more helpful. And use consistent language. A lot of times in documentation, maybe even within the same page, I'll see like install this library, install this package, tool, project, framework, repo. I'll see the same thing referred to in many, many different ways when it's really referring to the same thing. Sometimes there are subtle differences. But if it's referring to the exact same thing, I recommend being consistent and just choosing one. And it doesn't matter whether it's library or package or tool. Like something that is going to be like hopefully like familiar to newcomers and people who are already in the ecosystem. And then just stick with it and make sure you always use that word. If you're switching back and forth between library and package, people will start asking questions like, so is a library different from a package, or what's going on? And follow established conventions in the communities that you're a part of when they make sense. For example, higher order function. I'm not going to ask people to raise their hand if they know what a higher order function is. But more people in this room than would raise their hand actually use higher order functions in their work. It's a function that returns a function. This is barely longer than the fancy computer science term, I don't know why we use it. This is a term that people who know what functions are and know what returning is understand it immediately. It's like, oh, a function that returns a function. Yeah, I use that all the time. But when they think higher order function, it's like, I'm probably not smart enough to do that. It's probably like some kind of fancy technique. And really, you've been getting along fine, so you haven't needed this word in order to talk about it. So avoid overcomplicated jargon and stay on topic. I'm going to skip this out of the sake of time, but sometimes you can go, this is why Ruby's guide to, I'm going to skip it. Chris, you just said you were going to skip it. Don't try to go on a lot of tangents, is what I'm saying. And be very wary of religion, politics, and sex in your documentation. I try to keep them completely out. For reasons that you can probably think of. I can talk to you more one-on-one. This is a little bit controversial sometimes with people, to tell you more about what I mean, unless you're representing yourself. You know, if you're representing a project or a team, then I think you should generally keep these things out of it. But when you're representing yourself, like on Twitter or something like that, or in your personal repos, like, yeah, definitely stand up for things that you believe in. Use your platform. Now, for maintaining inclusive docs, I recommend staying wise. That doesn't mean a lot. What kind of tip is that? What can you do with that? Especially after making mistakes. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what I mean with examples. So this is a commit that was made the other week in our events page. Does anybody guess why this was a controversial commit? So there's some disagreement about whether Hong Kong and Taiwan are in China. And people feel very strongly about these things. And so this kind of blew up. And people were calling each other's names. And Ben, another member, Ben Hong, another member of our community who maintains that View events page, He handled this by staying calm. He didn't jump to getting defensive. He listened to everyone. He gathered information one-on-one with people so they'd feel more comfortable. They're not like on stage. Mirrored and validated. Moderated hostility. And he was vulnerable. He admitted that, like, I'm not sure what the right way to solve this is. Like, what can we do? What would be a good compromise for you? And he found a solution that everybody seems to be only slightly annoyed with, which is the best that we could do. And he managed that in less than a day. I recommend working with translators. If you can put your docs into a bunch of other different languages, it's going to make it more accessible for people. Everyone feels more comfortable in their native language. And I also like to give translators the freedom to actually add a little bit of humor and use different grammar conventions, to do things a little bit differently than we do. As long as they feel like they have good reasons, because they know this culture better than we do. And for some translations, like a Spanish translation, like English is an international language, which is why we keep most humor out of the docs. But Spanish is a very international language too, and very culturally diverse. So that is the same problem. But with Vietnamese, for example, there are more assumptions that can be made about the culture. And so we give them the freedom to experiment and try a little humor and see where that line is for Vietnamese. And a lot of people have told us that their Vietnamese docs, the Chinese docs, the Russian docs, and a lot of other docs translated to other languages are much better written than our English docs. And it's wow, it just feels so friendly, and it feels like I'm just hanging out with a friend rather than learning something. And it's the English docs are good too. It's very friendly, and it's it's a good tone and everything, but it's just this is much better writing. And you can only get that if you allow people to make the docs truly their own. And they're also going to be more invested in maintaining those translations if they feel like it's more personal to them rather than just translating word for word what it is that we came up with writing in English. And I also recommend allowing other languages in issues. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Have non-native speakers review docs. So important. They will often find things that you would never find and actually are confusing a lot of people, a lot more people than you thought. Yeah, I know. So real quick, mind if I'm going to take 2 more minutes. There are 2 problems in open source, when people make PRs and when people don't make PRs. Sarah Vieira, friend to you, member of the Code Sandbox team. So you definitely want to make sure that you're maintaining a friendly tone when people are making PRs. Make issues in PRs easy by having a link to new issue forms on all the docs pages. Someone reports a problem, there is a problem. It may not be the problem they think it is, but open that dialogue and see what the problem is and what kind of solution could solve that root problem that they encountered. Assume positive tone when people are talking to you, especially since they might not be speaking a native language. Be kind. As Anfan says in the Vue team, the world is full of talented people. We need more nice people. And finally, we define the culture. I think writing documentation and other educational resources, writing communication with a community, in many ways defines the culture that we're creating in that community, the kinds of people who want to be part of that community. And if we assume a bunch of knowledge, if we dismiss people's questions, if we make people feel like they're stupid, other people in the community will too. I've seen that happen again and again. If you make it feel very welcoming and open, if you listen and you validate, and you accept input from everyone, and not just accept, seek input from everyone, that's the kind of culture you'll create. And I feel very, very grateful to be part of the Vue community. Thank you very much. I'm Fritz, and you can find these slides later when I upload them at fritz.netlify.com/slides inclusive docs. I will upload them like later today.